Hi, my name is Case Johnson. I'm the manager for the Utah Center for the Book, and today I'm excited to share with you a panel with Betsy Gaines Quammen and David Quammen in Moab, Utah, back at Beyond Books. They were there to discuss two books. First off, their new book, Betsy's new book, True West by Torrey House Press, and David's book, Breathless, that you can find here. Enjoy. I think it was such a great interview in Moab. Thank you to all of our funders at Utah Humanities. Watch all the rest of the videos.
Welcome. My name's Sherry, and I do the buying here, and I'm also the events coordinator. And the owner, actually back at Beyond David, is right in the back there.
Hi.
Wave at David. So we're here collectively and excited to be here. Before we actually get going, I wanted to just let everyone know what's actually happening. It has been a busy month, and next month, all over actually, here, especially here in Moab. Of course, we had some eclipse stuff going on, but I'm glad that we're all here together. On Friday at 7 p.m. here at Back of Beyond, we're also going to be, this event is co-sponsored and collectively given to you by Torrey House Press. Here's Kirsten over here, Torrey House Press, yes, and the Utah Humanities Book Festival, of course, in conjunction with us. And so that's happening today, as well as this Friday. We are going to have this dynamic duo, Karen Anderson, What Falls Away, and Amber Karen. These are actually short stories, and this one is a full-length novel. Both of them will be here in conversation and reading from their books at 7 p.m. right here, exactly in this place this Friday. So that's the 20th. And then on the 24th, in co-sponsorship with the Grand County Public Library, we're going to be presenting Dave Showalter's Living River. And he actually, it's called Living River, The Promise of the Mighty Colorado. He'll take us on a kind of an audio-visual journey through the Colorado Plateau River watershed. So he'll have lots of slides, and there's lots of beautiful imagery in there. And then on November 3rd, this is also in co-sponsorship with the Grand County Public Library. Oh, and by the way, this will be at the library, won't be here. And then we're also going to be welcoming Barbara Jones Brown, Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre, and its aftermath. This is a new book just put out by Richard Turley and Barbara Brown. We won't be able to get Richard, unfortunately, but we will get Barbara. And this will be on November 3rd at 7 p.m. at the library, discussing the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So those are all coming up. And I have to say, I just came back from the fall conference, which is our kind of regional booksellers association conference. So I got to see Betsy there, and that was really fun. And Kirsten was there as well. We were all there and enjoying the lusciousness of being around a ton of booksellers in the region, getting showered with books, taking 7 boxes home with us. And so yeah, it's really fun. If you like books, it's kind of a little bit of heaven. And so we were excited that then, just kind of coming off that event, we were going to have Betsy and David here with us tonight. I just want to give you a little sense for who is up here, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. Betsy Gaines Quammen is an environmental historian and conservationist. Her first book is American Zion, and I can tell you we've sold a ton of copies. We honestly can't keep it in. It's really quite extraordinary. It's the Clive and Bundy, God and Public Lands in the West, also from Torrey House Press. She lives in Montana with her husband. Of course, David's here with us. And from what I gather, they share their home with 3 Russian wolfhounds. Is that still right? Yes?
One's a half.
One's a half, okay. Is there still a cross-eyed, possibly overweight cat? Oscar, and then possibly a python named Boots. Is that correct?
He's still there.
So we've got some interesting animal antics here. And then, of course, David is here with us as well. 16 previous books, including The Tangled Tree, The Song of the Dodo, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, and Spillover. He's written for The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, among other periodicals, and is 3-time winner of the National Magazine Award. Both Betsy and David, honestly, for Back and Beyond, are beloved authors. We've been selling their books. We sell their books well. They fit completely right within our mission and our demographic. So really excited to have you here. Thanks for coming. And then also today we're actually excited that Kirsten's here. We don't have her here very often. And Kirsten, of course, is the co-executive director, publisher, as well as co-founder of Torrey House Press, which is in our hearts, our heart-loved, beloved press and connection with them. And she'll be our facilitator today, and will lead the conversation, the discussion, with a Q&A after. So let's welcome all three of them.
That's right. Thanks, Sherry, so much. Yeah. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I want to give a little shout out to Catherine Metcalf, who is creative director at Torrey House, and Mark Bailey, who with me is co-founder of Torrey House Press. And want to acknowledge that tonight we are gathered on the traditional homelands of Ute, Navajo, and Paiute people. And I invite you to learn more about about the people who have lived here for a long time, and the people who live here now. This bookstore is a beautiful place to learn more. And welcome. I want to thank Back and Beyond Books. Thank David Everett and Sherry. And this store is an institution. So when Mark and I were first kind of thinking, wow, maybe we'll be publishers, we stopped in here and talked with then owner Andy Nettle, and we kind of just sat at his knees for about an hour while he told us so much about the industry from the bookseller point of view. And we really learned a lot about how to be publishers in partnership with independent bookstores. And it's such a joy always to walk into a store. Independent bookstores are pillars of democracy, and every one of them has built a foundation in its community. And thank you for keeping this fabulous place alive. And so I'm so excited to be here with David and Betsy. In March of 2020, Betsy's book American Zion came out. That's a good time to publish a book. She couldn't pick that one better, you know. So the first thing that we did was cancel all of her events. She had, a bunch, and then we had to figure out how do we get her book in conversation, because she's writing about so many important things with public lands and militias and conspiracies. And the way we figured out how to do that was the David and Betsy show.
No, we call it the Betsy and Dave show.
The Betsy and Dave show. And Torrey House Press is a nonprofit book publisher. We are not a television studio, so we had a lot of rough shows at the beginning on Facebook Live, where we couldn't quite get all of the cameras going, and got Zoom bombed once, but then we kind of got it on a roll. And Betsy and David,
I wasn't even looking for it.
Had conversations, probably over a dozen, that in the couple of months right after the book came out, each with a kind of different theme, talking about the ways that their work intersected. And of course, David's book Breathless had become a really important book at that moment, since he had pretty much predicted what we were experiencing.
That was actually Spillover.
Oh, I mean,
It's already published.
Oh, what did I say?
Breathless.
He was working on
right,
it.
sorry.
Excuse me for.
Yeah, correcting, right, Spillover. It was, Spillover that came out in 2012, right. And then he started working on Breathless, so. Anyway, it's a joy to be here in person. thank you both
So
for.
do you remember, David, where you were in March of 2020, Australia or Africa maybe?
I was in Tasmania in February of 2020, and then I flew home.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Betsy had asked
Betsy
me.
is really friendly, but yeah, I think you were still gone when we met with Betsy,
Yeah.
probably in February.
Right.
We were up in Bozeman, and we'd been down in Yellowstone. And Betsy said, I've been talking to my husband, and you know, I figured I could steal a hug when we were leaving, but she stuck her finger in my face.
Oh, the days of the.
Back in the day.
Back in the day of
Yeah,
2020.
this virus could become serious. Like people were saying.
It's good to all be here where we're a little
I
safer.
took it
again.
seriously.
Yeah.
You know, I broke out my nose with my
Oh. One other quick thank you before we get going on with our conversation is a shout out to Utah Humanities.
Please.
Kate Johnson is here in the back, running a little TV studio, and he is the director for the Center of the Book, and that's the arm of Utah Humanities that organizes the Book Festival, which is a statewide celebration of books and basically the freedom to read. So, Case, thank you for being here. Utah Humanities is another really important part of the strength of Torrey House Press because they were early grant. We were a grantor. We still are. We do still receive grants from them, and because Utah Humanities has a statewide mandate, we really started working harder at developing relationships around the state in rural places. Like, I don't know if Moab still counts as rural these days, but the not Wasatch Front places. So a big thank you to Utah Humanities and Case and Center for the Book as well. You can learn more about David's work at his website. He's easy to find, and Betsy's work at her website. Betsy and Case recently did a super fantastic podcast. You can go to Check Your Shelves and find out more about that conversation. That was as good as it could be. But for now, let's dive in to talking with these two fabulous authors. I want to kind of start out with how did Heartbeat of the Wild, David's latest book, how did Heartbeat of the Wild and True West come to the page? David, do you want to start that one?
I'll start on Heartbeat of the Wild. It is this book. About 1999, National Geographic called me up and asked me to start writing some stories for them. I had been writing about conservation, wild places, wild creatures for 20 years before that. But then I started about a 20-year sequence of doing that sort of work for National Geographic magazine. And they sent me all over the world to wild places to write about wild creatures and the scientists who study them and the conservationists who try to preserve them. And at the end of that period of time, National Geographic Books said, why don't we collect a number of these, it turned out to be 21 of these stories, in a book to be published by National Geographic Books, my regular publisher, Simon & Schuster. So I said, yes, of course. But then they said, but add some value to it. Make it a book and not just a collection. So what this is a book based on 21 stories from National Geographic about wild places, wild creatures, conservation, how it works and doesn't work in the 21st century. Pulled together with new material, connective tissue, storytelling about how the stories happened, how they were connected one to the other, updating of the reporting in the stories from the different places, the different creatures, the different projects, with a new introduction, a new forward and a new afterword, talking about conservation, the why and the how in the 21st century. So, as I told Kirsten last night, I think of this as my narrative manifesto of conservation in the 21st century.
Love it, love it. Betsy, tell us a little bit about how True West came to find its place between the covers.
Well, you might have to help me a little bit with this because it was originally conceived when I bounced the idea off you. I was saying, oh, we need to do something on anti-science and misinformation because I felt like we were drowning in it. And then I started to realize, oh my gosh, everybody has their own version of the truth. It's not that easy to navigate this idea of misinformation and the idea of truth. And so what I decided to do was really go out and interview people. I think I interviewed over 100 people, and part of that was coming from a need to get out. I mean, I got vaccinated and I was ready to talk to people, and I really wanted to navigate what the truth meant. But what I ended up doing is essentially taking a tour through what we came to regard, and I say we because I feel like I did it in collaboration both with Kirsten and David, because these were my only people that I was talking to for a while. You know, we're all in our little submarines and we're putting up our periscope, and these were two of the people that I was looking around at. And so what I sort of thought about is, how is the West a museum of toxic myths? And that ranges from everything from rugged individualism to cowboy mythology to blank slates to free land, to the West as a salubrious, healthy place. And I know that in Moab, you had everybody and their mother coming here and saying, we just need to get out in fresh air and, you know, be away from COVID, which of course they were bringing with them to these tiny communities. And the same thing happened in Bozeman. And so this was a way for me to look at misinformation, misunderstandings, and notions of the truth amidst a museum of toxic myths. And what I realized in doing my research is that, and I shouldn't say I realized, I mean, I feel like as a historian, I understand this, but I think what was reaffirmed is that to understand the West is to understand America. And so in this book, it's a companion piece in some ways to American Zion. I trace the militia maneuvering into the West to the January 6th insurrection. I look at what it means, what the West mean to the American psyche, or the, you know, at that moment, the West became so important through the show Yellowstone, of all things, and everybody was buying a second home, or, you know, coming to work remotely, or seeking this ranching lifestyle that didn't exist. And so this book, I think, really evolved through pandemic, through polarization, and through continued conversation with people.
Love it, love it. It was fun to work with you as this book began to take shape.
Sometimes it wasn't so fun. I know.
It
I
was
was like,
pretty-
what am I doing?
It was pretty great. But it evolved. It definitely evolved.
Yeah.
We were actually looking up your book contract, and
It's so different.
we actually have a contract for you to deliver a book on ant science.
Oh, and science.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
We just-
Edward O. Wilson was
Yeah, I was
coming
gonna
to
say,
the end of his life,
right,
and
yeah. Pretty excited.
somebody needed to pick up the torch.
Yeah, totally. The True West came out of this. I wanted tell us a little bit about this cover. Hold up the cover and
So, these are my dolls. This is what I grew up playing with. It's Johnny and Jane West. And I do have to say that the indigenous, the Native woman was always my sisters and my favorite. And so we would always fight to play with the beautiful Native woman. She was definitely the one that we always feuded over. But these are our toys, and this was our first introduction to the West. Growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then taking trips to Colorado growing up. So, yes, they're pretty creepy and wonderful.
we were on a Zoom conversation, co-executive director Will Neville-Raven and I with Betsy. I don't know what we were talking about.
Book stuff.
We were talking about book stuff. Maybe we were talking about book stuff. And maybe we were talking about covers. Were you on that call too? Yeah. So it was our cover conversation.
Yeah.
And
She said, wait a minute.
she said, wait a minute.
I've got some dolls.
And she went
They're
and
in
got
my
the dolls and, brought the horse out, and it was pretty great. And Kathleen said, oh boy, I bet we can do something with this. And, one of the things we love about it is it really embodies this interrogation of myth. And, you know, is that what the West is? Is the West those people? It is not those people, but that's often our entree into it, isn't it? Often that is the introduction for people to learn about what the West really is. With some cowboys and Indians and horses, yes. As your work, how do you see these two books, your latest books together, intersecting? It's, you know, when American Zion came out and Spillover was having its resurgence, there were so many ways that those two books really kind of connected in surprising ways. These two books here, how do the two of you see your work kind of intersecting with Heartbeat of the Wild and True West?
In some ways, my other book from the last year, Breathless, which is about the coronavirus, and the science about it, and the misunderstanding about it, and the lies about it, and the misinformation about it, intersects a little bit more with this. But these are both, they're both about wild places and humans in wild places, and the impacts that humans and their understanding of wild places has on wild places, and their understanding of one another and their interactions with one another have to do with the landscapes in which they and other creatures exist.
I'm going to come back to that notion in just a little bit.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
No, I mean, what I was just gonna say, and you know, this is so true for both of us. We love the land so much, and I think that in looking at how we proceeded with these books, we really tried to understand that loving the land isn't enough, that there has to be a real understanding of the culture in and around the land.
Yes.
And so both of these books, I think, look at the people who inhabit the lands that are so well loved, and what that means, and how we can understand effective conservation of you know, these lands in through relationship building.
And I think also our shared sense, that's another way of saying that, our shared urgent sense of, if things go on like this among human beings, nothing that's beautiful and non-human is going to be left.
Right. This is a good time to hear a little bit from the end of Heartbeat of the Wild.
Okay, you want me to
Would
read that
us
passage?
that passage?
Okay, I will read a passage that Kirsten has chosen, or suggested, this is from the afterword of the book, after I've told these 21 stories and how they're connected to one another and connected to the conservation enterprise. And this is a little less than 2 pages long, and I'm going to read it somewhat quickly, but passionately, just to save us time.
We have all the time to listen to you.
This book is also intended as a reminder and a goad about the personal responsibilities each of us bears in the weighty matter of determining the future of biological diversity on our planet. We cannot let the wildness of the Serengeti and other such great landscapes vanish from this earth simply because we feel comfortably distant from such wildness, and because its protection is a task for those heroic others, meaning the ones I've written about here. We need to think about the things we are doing, and we are all doing some things with every meal we eat, every mile we travel, every product we consume, every house we build, every child we conceive, to diminish those features of wildness I mentioned at the start, those necessary elements for the continuation of the great heartbeat, the emergent property that makes wildness really wild. Why a tiger in a zoo may be a dangerous animal, but a tiger in a zoo is not wildness, because it's not a system, it's not huge, it's not an interconnected ecosystem. The continuation of the great heartbeat, the scale and connectivity of natural landscapes, the biological diversity within them, the processes by which those living creatures and their environment interact. We need to plan a secure future, not just for ourselves and our offspring, if we have offspring, but also for the lions, bonobos, elephants, salmon, polar bears, legless lizards, and giant bees with which we share our world. We need to ponder our impacts, individual as well as collective, and find the will sometimes to constrain them. It's more than a matter of writing checks to the Jane Goodall Institute or the Audubon Society, but by all means do. It's personal. It's the choices we make. It's what we buy and what we burn and what we care about. It's where we place our feet. I've tried to make this book something other than a gloomy diagnosis or a howl of complaint about the losses of wildness this planet has suffered and is suffering. I've tried to offer you some enjoyment, some amusement, even some hope. As you have seen, it's a book about people as much as about places and ecological processes and other living creatures. It's meant as a paean to the hardy, smart women and men who do field biology, conservation, and the institutional work that supports those twin disciplines, including, but obviously not limited to, Mike Fay, Lee White, Jane Goodall, and I list a number of the people who are characters in this book. Last of whom is Chris Tompkins, who may be familiar, and many others you've encountered in this book. I hope you've found them to be, like some of the other creatures mentioned herein, a diverse and appealing fauna. People are the problem on this planet, but people are also the only solution. It's late, but it's not too late. We still have great landscapes and great chances all over the world. The heart of the wild inheres in the scale, connectivity, diversity, and processes of great ecosystems, as I've said. So long as we humans recognize that reality, respect it, and take pains to preserve those elements through fervent and wise efforts, such as I've described in this book, amid magnificent places, including those featured here, but others as well, that heart will continue beating. And that's the end of the book.
That line really struck me, that people are you said it better than I'm going to, but people are the problem, but they are also the only solution. And I think that both of your books speak to that in different ways. You know, David, you're speaking to conservation, that only people can really make the decisions about how we protect landscapes and creatures and the habitats that they need. And Betsy, you're talking about people are the only way that we're going to make it through really crazy political divides, right? Speak a little bit about some of the conversations that you had, Betsy, that brought you to that place where this subtitle, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America, kind of came to embody some of the work that you had done.
Yeah, as I said, it was a companion piece to American Zion. And in American Zion, I write about the Bundy family, who are the family in Bunkerville, Nevada, who took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. Do you all know that story? Yeah. And Cliven Bundy is the patriarch, and he is in Bunkerville, Nevada. And 2 years before Malheur, the wildlife takeover in Oregon, there had been an armed standover the cattle that he had. They continued to be in trespass after his permit was no longer legal. So I was looking at what happened when I first talked to the Bundy family, and I went down and spent time with them. It was part of my dissertation, and then it became American Zion, the book. And I talked to them about their religious points of view, and this was the year before the Oregon takeover and the year after the Battle of Bunkerville. And I've heard a term. Do you all know Todd Wilkinson? Do you know the Mountain Journal? Anyway, it's a really wonderful online magazine. And he used to live across the street from us, and we talked about the Bundys, and when I wrote the book, I thought they were an outlier. And he said, well, I think we've seen the Bundification of the West. And I said, I think we've seen the Bundification of America. And so, when I was looking at what happened on January 6th, I had already seen over the course of months, and David can attest to it because I was getting more and more nervous, looking at how these militia folks and some of the main players in the Battle of Bunkerville, one of which was Stuart Rhodes. Do you all know Stuart Rhodes, who's now in jail in prison for 18 years? And he was a major architect of the January 6th insurrection. And I saw him in advance of the election saying it was going to be stolen. And he was sharing a stage at this conspiracy theory conference called the Red Pill Expo with all these anti-vaxxers. And I was looking at these coalitions that were being built that hadn't been, I mean, these were yoga moms next to militia, next to, people who believe that there are aliens among us and QAnon adherents and whatnot. And I thought, oh my God, they're really amassing this great big group of people. And this is a really long way of me answering the question, because what I saw was terrifying, and I thought, this is craziness and Trumpism that's just, these chickens have come home to roost. But what I was also seeing, at the time I was writing the book, Ammon Bundy was running for governor of Idaho. Did you all follow that to some extent? And so he was amassing an enormous support, but I was seeing conservative Republicans in Idaho fighting this radicalization, this extremism, and I was particularly seeing it. He was in Meridian. No, he was not. He was in Emmett, Idaho, and which was down closer to Boise. But what I was seeing in the Idaho Panhandle were neo-Nazis, extremists, people who wanted to create homeland. I mean, they saw Idaho as a geography where they could take their extremist ideas and, in the footsteps of Richard Butler, who was Aryan Nations, that the Center for, the Southern Poverty Law Center sued into smithereens, and he lost his compound, and the community had really rallied against him. Well, I was watching conservative Republicans rallying against the most extreme of the extreme, and I was talking to these Republicans who were calling me and saying, please pay attention to what we're trying to do. I mean, the Patriot Front, and I don't know if you remember when the Patriot Front, who did have support in the Idaho Panhandle, that's the militia group that came to a gay pride event, and 31 of them were arrested. And again, I write about this, but I'm now seeing these conservative Republicans that are taking back their school boards, that are wanting an open primary ballot so they don't have the extremists of the extreme who usually win in primaries because it's only the people who are really whipped up who go to vote and they determine the candidates. They are building coalitions with Democrats and Republicans in these geographies that have been targeted by, I don't know if you've heard of the American Redoubt, the movement of, it's essentially a campaign to say, let's build like-minded Christian nationalist communities in the Idaho Panhandle. And so it's people coming from the outside, taking over this geography, saying, this is homeland, a myth of the West. This is where we're going to establish our community, because nobody really lives here. And the people who live here are saying, well, fuck you, we actually do, and we're taking back our place. And so that gives me, that was something that I was seeing that was really giving me hope, and because they're fighting like crazy. So anyway, that was a long answer.
Oh, it's a good answer, yeah. Right, it's painting too broad of a brush in any direction is really not only missing nuance and reality, but it's missing the opportunities for the conversations or relationships that can make a difference.
It really can, and unless these folks are in dialogue with each other, if they're gonna be siloed and say, you're a Democrat, you're a rhino, which is the thing they use, Republican in name only, but they are coming together and saying, we cannot have this happen in our communities. We cannot have our books banned, we cannot have our teachers fired, and we can't have voter intimidation and whatnot, and it really has been an encouraging coalition building moment, and it does give me hope considering where we are nationally.
Oh, yeah, that's great. David, what gives you hope in the world of conservation, in the context of the heartbeat of the wild? Where are the signs of hope for you?
I've been asked that before. We've all been asked that before. It's an important question about hope. And the first thing that I have to say about it always is that I believe that hope is a duty. It's not a psychological condition, it's not a mood, it's a duty. So what gives me hope is the fact that my heart is still beating and I have still work to do. And there are other people who realize that we all have work to do. And my feeling that there is nothing more important than this. And it may be a long shot. It may be highly improbable, but not impossible, that we can do this. We can save our democratic communities, and we can save our wild lands and our wild creatures. That 100 years from now, there will still be lions in the wild in Africa, and polar bears in the Arctic, and lowland gorillas in the Congo. It's possible 100 years from now, that will still be the case. It's also possible that it's not the case, that we fail. But I'm inspired by people, some great conservationists that I've been privileged to be friends with, like I just mentioned Ed Wilson, Jane Goodall. Those two people just will not hear of the possibility that anybody would give up, that anyone would succumb to the guilty indulgence of despair simply because the odds are very bad. They wouldn't hear of it, and I follow them in that. I believe in hope, and I have hope because we have to have hope. It's our duty to have hope,
Duty, yeah.
to keep fighting for these things.
Love that. It reminds me of Mark and I were in Paonia, Colorado, just in late 2019, a few months before Michael Soule died. We sat down with Michael Soule, who is considered kind of the father of conservation biology, the idea that wildlife biology could be in the service of actually doing something and not just collecting data, that there was there could be a moral imperative to it. And we had the most wonderful dinner with Michael Soule, and he talked to us about possibilism, where he says, it's really important that we don't completely lose hope. It's really important to not spread despair. We don't know, he says, that aliens aren't going to come down and solve all of our problems for us. Which not very likely, but we don't know that won't happen. That it's important to stay open to the possible and step into an attitude of possibilism, which really feels to me like another way of hope as a duty. We do all the things that we can, and we stay firmly connected to the idea that there can be a better way and a better world. Yeah.
Michael Soule was a great elder in this concern.
Absolutely, yeah. So your Heartbeat of the Wild came out in August, is that right?
Came out in May of this year.
In May, okay. And True West officially pubs next week.
9 days.
So yeah, those of you who get a copy from Back of Beyond tonight, you're a 9 days ahead of everybody else. So you are both writers. You're both living in the same home with all of the many animals. Do you read each other's work in process? In progress? Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I think you should answer first.
Do you read each other's work in progress?
No, David reads mine. I'm dyslexic, and I really admire. He doesn't need me to read his stuff. I mean, I read it and love it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is the best thing I've ever read. When he reads mine, he has editorial comments and is incredibly helpful. And I really, and Kirsten's been the same way. I love editors, and I will have 5 people read my things and give me feedback, and it's something I'm really grateful for. But David doesn't need that. So when I read it, I just think, oh my gosh, this is perfect.
Well, I love editors too, but I only have one at a time.
I have a village of
So David,
So sometimes I say to Betsy, like, 2 or 3 years after my book is published. Have you read my book yet? No, that's an
That's not
exaggeration.
true. I
That's
do
not-
read your. I do.
That's not an
And
exaggeration.
with Breathless, I read it and I listened to it on Audible.
Oh
You
boy.
did, yeah.
Yes, how about that?
Yeah.
Oh, forget it.
That's great. But you read his finished products. I mean, no wonder. No wonder you say this is really good. He's been through the ringer with his editors.
But he's never through the ringers with this. I mean, you barely get like, and if
Oh,
an
no.
editor makes more than a couple of shots, you think, well, he's really.
No.
editing.
Hold on. For instance, I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine about the question of the origin of the coronavirus and the question of if the evidence is abundantly on the side of natural origin, spillover from a wild animal, why is public opinion heavy on the side of, oh, it was a lab leak, and Tony Fauci had something to cover it. That was, I wrote it in April, May, and June. It was published in July. And they edited the bejesus out of me, and I worked hard through lots of different versions, and it ended up a long piece for a magazine piece, 9,000 word piece. The beginning was different, the middle was different, the end was different. I didn't do anything that I didn't think made good sense. I did do some things that annoyed me at the time. There were points when I was thinking about, maybe I should just take this piece elsewhere. But don't tell. Oh. Hey.
We'll cut right there.
I had
It's
a
a
wonderful
terrific piece
experience.
that you
I
haven't read.
had a wonderful experience with an editor named Bill Wasik and an editor-in-chief named Jake Silverstein. Loved them. The final product was sweat and blood of theirs as well as mine. Lots of editing, lots of rewriting. Sometimes it's not quite that rigorous with books because books are a little bit more the baby darling of the author than a magazine piece usually is. But I've had great editing on books too, especially from the current guy, Bob Bender at Simon & Schuster, who carefully edited Breathless. And this book, a lady named Susan Hitchcock at National Geographic Books, she pushed me hard too.
I remember.
Yeah, she said, no, that's not enough. Give me more on that. I don't think this works. Give me more on that. Do some more work. The thing that is annoying about editors is when they say, do some more work. Because you always, writing, as you all probably know or can imagine, is one among the many forms of really hard work. So you want an editor, you always dream of the editor saying, oh, David, oh, Betsy, I got the piece. It's perfect. The presses are going to roll tomorrow. We don't want to touch anything. Because then they're not saying, do some more work.
And I do have to say, one of the, in addition to Kirsten and David reading, I was a journalist for the Telluride Times Tribune, and even though that doesn't exist anymore, my editor, Marta Tarbell, has read both books, and she has ripped them to shreds, and I have to say, when I see that read, I'm like, oh good, it makes me feel like I can make it better, so I love to be edited, but I'm a weirdo.
Pitchers in baseball like to have catchers. Otherwise, if they don't strike the batter out, the ball goes who knows where.
I was going to say the same thing.
I
Took the words right out of my mouth.
I've got baseball on the brain. I had a long nightmare last night about trying out for a high school baseball team at the age of 75. It wasn't going well.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're going to invite you all into the conversation. We would really love to welcome your questions of Betsy and David, or Betsy or David. After we have some conversation among all of us, Betsy will be closing us out with a wonderful piece selection from her book. The floor is yours. Any questions for David and Betsy about their work, about their super great dynamic together.
Comments or personal criticisms?
Yeah,
or-
go ahead. Yeah.
So Betsy, I was really, you were talking about the optimism of having conservatives, work with, whatever your ilk or against the extreme right persuasion that was coming into town. So I just wondered if your book has examples of what I could use to give myself that same kind of optimism.
I hope
Because
so.
right now.
Did everybody hear that? Okay, looking for examples of how to help yourself feel optimistic.
Yeah, I'm sorry I cut you off. Did you have?
No, that's right. No, it's just, it seems impossible to me, and I don't see anything that makes me feel like, oh, it's gonna be okay, because there's some reasonableness out there. I don't think there's reasonableness out there anymore.
And
Lance.
well, what I would say is I agree that there are people who are absolutely unreasonable. What my motivation was seeing rapid radicalization, and I was watching it, as I said, I was seeing the bundification of the West and America, and so I really felt a sense of urgency to go out and look at rural communities in particular and see if they were beyond hope. And I found that there was a lot of opportunity to talk to people, to be in relationship with people, to find places that we did agree, to actually, and this is gonna sound really woo-woo, but actually to feel real love towards people that I had been, and I was as guilty as anybody. I had been, during COVID, I'd been behind my computer, I'd been watching, news story after news story after news story, feeling so angry about the misinformation and about Trumpism and about all the garbage that was happening. And I felt really, I did not feel kindly towards people. And I will tell you that I really have forged relationships with people who could not see politics more differently than me. And I think one of the things that stuck with me the most, that will keep me talking to people and trying to obnoxiously worm my way into people's hearts and let them worm their way into mine, is I met a guy who had told me he'd been radicalized, and he was so angry, and it gave me pause. And we ended up becoming, we're great friends. He read my book, he
A rancher in tiny rural
Montana.
eastern Montana.
But he told me, if I had not met you, I would have been scared of you. And to me, that's enough reason to keep going, because there are people who love that dynamic. There are people who are raising money off of it, and there are people who are keeping power because of that. And I know it's not easy, and it's not something that, I can say, oh, just go and be friends with people. But my biggest fear during this book at times was this idea of othering one another, to the point where we do get to a place of violence, and I've seen it. This is happening, and unless we're willing to say, we're gonna work around these narratives and go and really create relationships with people who we disagree with, we are going to play into this othering. And there are people who want us to be othering each other. So that's, it's not easy, but I hope my book talks about the importance of it, and even talks about the joy of it.
We have a quarter of a side of beef in our freezer downstairs from that rancher.
Yeah, my dad's met him now. He's so funny. He's sending me messages. Do you know this podcaster? Have you reached out to her? So, and it just, we could not be more different.
I really like that story. I think connecting with people on an individual level really makes a big difference. I spent all of the pandemic working as a nurse, mostly in critical care. Maybe in another year I'll have enough strength to read your book.
I understand.
Still a little sensitive topic,
I
but
understand.
I really found, and I happened, I live here, but I was working in a pretty red area, just very different mindset than what I was experiencing when I would work here at home, and that was really hard at first. But I really found, as I started to just really try to connect with some of even the people I worked with in healthcare, that when they buy into some of these conspiracy theories, and just try to give them space that they could express themselves a little bit, that realized they were just as afraid as everybody else, but just for different reasons, and I think the comment that you made that, and I think this is what drives it so much, which just breaks my heart, but I think people profit off of it, and I think that's why it's as bad as it is, because I think that there's all the algorithms on our social media and even on trusted news networks. You know, when you click on the clickbait, you make them money. So just stop clicking it. Like, I just don't Facebook much anymore at all, and I look at my cousins and stuff, and they're boring. They just have kids, you know, like, I don't know. I found, for a while I felt like maybe I was just disengaged, but really what I found was, like, when you feed into all of that stuff, if you don't just really make true connections with people, and it was hard when we were asking people to stay home, that's how you connected, was online, and then there's just all those sidebars of ads and sensationalized news, you know, like these sensationalized articles, like the headline's sensationalized, and then you read it and you're like, that was the most boring and worst, like, poorly researched article, but yet you clicked it and I fed into it, and I found unplugging. I have a coworker that literally has on his arm tattooed UTFP, and it's on the fuck plug. And he literally tattooed that on his arm, and during the pandemic. And honestly, it's
Where
just
were
so
you
true.
working?
So I worked here, and then I also worked over at St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction, Colorado, and the ICU up there, and it was just a very, I mean, I thought I'd learned a lot as an adult about people, and I didn't realize there was a whole other level that I had not even
That's
touched.
Lauren Belbert's district.
Yes.
So,
Grand Junction is?
Yes.
it doesn't surprise
The more
me.
you know.
And, you know, I met some really great people over there, and I have some really good friends from that time, and some of them, we don't always have the same politics, but I think that's the thing, is like, instead of trying to connect over these polarizing things, we made real connections as people, and just people trying to live, and I have a neighbor that's actually really similar to that, but yet, when we broke it down, like, we're just trying to live and get through and survive some of the nuttiness, and we actually had so much more in common, and I think that just made a big difference.
Great, thanks.
Signing the path.
I have a question, and it's for the both of you. It seems that you're both really focusing on a virus. In one case, it's a chemical, scientific virus. In the other, it's a mental or state of mind virus. And they seem to be proliferating and transferring rapidly. And I think, Betsy, that's what you were talking about as the acceleration of radicalism, or the radicalization is accelerating. So I wonder if in your conversations you talk from those two perspectives, from the science perspective and from the historical perspective, or the contemporary issues perspective. Find out what's similar.
We have talked about that,
Yeah.
in the idea that the spread of these ideas of this anger, of this eagerness to accuse is a viral spread. We don't dwell on it, partly because I'm very wary of. I've written a lot about viruses. Kirsten mentioned my 2012 book Spillover, which is about viruses, and then Breathless. I'm wary of the metaphorizing of viruses, because there are so many realities of viruses that are intricate and consequential and counterintuitive, and I spend my time trying to get readers to absorb those details a bit more, so that they don't have a metaphorical idea of viruses. They have a more accurate idea of viruses. So I agree with you with that parallel, but I don't think it goes very far for us. I certainly never say, hey, you know, I'm a tin pot expert on viruses, and this spread of anger is like the spread of avian influenza and COVID-19, but not at all like Ebola and not at all like Nipah virus, and very different from Denver virus. I really want to bring people into the granularity of what biological viruses are.
But I will say that I think it's a really interesting point, because what happened with COVID accelerated this proliferation. It was the proliferation of misinformation on the back of of an actual virus. And so I don't think anybody could have anticipated how quickly people became entangled in misinformation because of COVID. And you know, I remember at the beginning of it thinking two things, Pollyanna that I am. Number one, this is going to be a great time for all of us to help each other. You know, people are certain different demographics and population, people of the you know, there are certain people who are going to be more susceptible. So, you know, those of us who maybe are a little younger or, you know, have a little extra time, we're going to be able to pitch in and really help each other. And then I also thought, gosh, if we just have a chance to really take our breaths and slow down, maybe we'll rethink all the things we do that contribute to climate change and this, that, and the other. And that didn't happen. People became angry and people became mad at one another, and people, as we were saying, use that opportunity to even make things more polarized. So I think your point is interesting in the sense that the virus, you know, that just sort of radicalization piggybacked on the virus.
Well, you know, crisis is a great opportunity for profit. I mean, you can provide an answer, you can provide all these things. I mean, I think profiteering off of fear, I mean, that's been going on throughout all the ages. I mean, snake oil, I mean,
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
That's what makes all of those fun history books so interesting to
true.
read. And yeah, I
But-
think we just saw it like happen in real time. It was crazy.
It was also true, one of the things that was most clear to me from the beginning, and I guessed some things wrong, I guessed as many things wrong as most people, but from the very beginning, January of 2020, I was thinking, and I think saying to you, well, this is going to be a big collision between civil liberties and public health.
Foresight there, for sure.
Well, yeah, and that's when I called Ammon and said, this is gonna be your next Malheur, and lo and behold, medical freedom was. I mean, he's now been sued for, the St. Luke's has won $22 million lawsuit against him for.
I have a different question.
Yeah, I just got a question.
So, you know, I have my own experience, but where do you write? Do you spread out at the kitchen table and yell at your spouse about how hard it is, or do you go off somewhere and just work? You know, close the door and just work.
That depends whether you want her to answer or me to answer.
Right.
We better hear them both,
Where do you
yes.
write?
Where do you rate?
I have a wonderful office, and I go in there and I close the door, and don't answer the phone, and don't pay attention to anything except Betsy when she comes and busts through the door and says, "Would you read this, please?"
Well, it's usually, or what are your emails, or I mean, it can be any number of things.
So
The busting through always happens, but I have a variety of different things.
We live in a nice house that has no guest room because it has two offices for two writers. Although Betsy still works mostly at the dining room table because her beautiful office is in a third floor turret with a spiral staircase, and dogs that are long, like borzos, find it very difficult to go up a spiral staircase, so they won't go up there. So if she wants the dogs nearby her, able to visit at what we call the love station, which is coming up for her to pet them on the head, then she has to work at the dining room table. So I work in my office and she works at the dining room table usually. Is it okay to give that away?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But we write every day when we're in the middle of these projects. You know, for me, the routine is you get up, you make coffee, you walk the dogs or some of the dogs, and then you sit down at the desk with a cup of coffee, and you read something related to work but not directly related to work, to wake up your brain for 20 or 30 minutes, and you drink more coffee, and you drink more coffee, and then you go into a trance and you write the book.
Excellent.
That sounds easy.
That's easy.
It's not always just
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so, and sometimes it's collaborative, in all directions. I finished my book about the coronavirus, and the scientists who study it, in the second week in December of 2021. My deadline was December 31st, and I started on January 1st, so I worked hard and got it done during that year. And Simon & Schuster was very enthusiastic about everything except the title. The title that I'd written it under was a novel virus, which is what scientists, the way scientists refer to a virus new to humans. This is a novel virus. And they said, no, that's boring, that's not it. So we went through title crisis, which is not unusual for an author of books. Sometimes you're lucky, and from the beginning, you have a great title like American Zion. You had that from the beginning, if I recall correctly. That's a great title. But sometimes you don't, and at the last minute, you and your editor and the publisher and your agent and your spouse are all in title finding panic. So we were in title finding panic for this book about the virus, and I can't even remember some of the bad possibilities that we had, but there were a number of them. And finally, we were going to settle on what we were going to settle on. I can't even remember now. I've suppressed it, but the final manuscript that I delivered had this title on it, and I wasn't happy with it. I could live with it, but I wasn't happy with it. And Betsy came into my office and said, "Don't give up. Let's think about this." She sat down in the easy chair in my office, and I was at my swivel chair, and we went back and forth. And she said, "What about losing your breath? What about catching the virus? Catching the virus was the title that we were going to go with. Catching the virus." I said, pun, I get it. Catching the virus. Scientists are trying to catch it and understand it, and people are catching it. So it was about to go to press as Catching the Virus. And Betsy came in and she said, "Don't give up. Let's think about this a little bit more." Da-da-da-da-da-da. And she said, "Catching your breath." And I said, not quite, but interesting. And then I said, "Breathless."
Yep.
And she said, "Yep." And I called my editor on the phone in New York, and he said, "Oh, okay, hold on a minute. I'll talk to you in 20 minutes. He hung up. He went down the corridor to talk to Jonathan Karp, the publisher of Simon & Schuster. He calls me back in 20 minutes. That's it. That's it. Everybody loves it. That's it. Problem solved.
That's great.
And it was that close
Yeah.
to being, and of course, Breathless. Okay, Jean-Paul Belmondo, Jean-Luc Godard, famous movie, Breathless, A Bout de Souffle. And I Googled and I saw that there are 6 or 7 romance novels that have been published. And we all just thought, who cares? You can't copyright a title, you can't copyright one word. It's really a good title for this book because the scientific effort to understand and defeat the virus, as I describe in the book, moment to moment, hour by hour during the first days. It's a breathless effort. So it's also a pun, but it's a better pun than Catching the Virus. And I wouldn't have had it if she hadn't come in my office.
See, that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
And a question like that have you ever, like your article that they're saying, your publishers are saying, cut. Have you ever felt in those critiques that you're losing your message? And that you're like, I have to have this. And how do you work through that?
You're talking about the New York Times?
Right,
magazine
is
article?
that...
They weren't saying cut. I delivered, they said, give us 5,000. I pitched the idea to them. They said, yeah, we love it. Give us 5,000 words, or maybe more if you need it. And I thought maybe 7,000 they would allow. So I gave them 7,000 words. And what they said, they didn't say cut. They said add.
Okay.
And then we ended up at 9,000 words, and I never thought these guys were going to publish 9,000 words on this subject. So they said, in some cases they said, cut this, but replace it with this and this. So there were some things that I cut that I liked, but none of them were baby darlings that I was gonna go to the wall over. When I had doubts about whether this editorial relationship was right, it was not over them saying, you know, cut this. It was more matters of larger scale shape.
But there have been points where you will go to the wall and say, I need this in one of your
Yes.
pieces.
Yes, and when you say that to a book editor, well, not always, but a book editor will generally say, well, in the end, it's your book. But I knew, because he was involved with my first novel a long time ago, 53 years ago, I knew a guy named Bob Gottlieb, who was a great New York book editor, and then for a while editor of the New Yorker. And he had edited Catch-22 for Joe Heller. And he told me the story of, he had insisted that Joseph Heller cut a chapter from Catch-22. And then when I met him 20 years later or so, Esquire magazine was publishing the lost chapter from Catch-22 with great fanfare. And Bob Gottlieb was saying, you know, what do I know? What do I know? I told Joe to cut this, and now everybody wants to read this lost chapter.
From an editor point of view, I feel that this is really sacred, special work, to work with someone's art, to work with someone's words, to work with someone's intellectual gift to the world. And I take that very seriously, that sense of, I want to be here to try to help this book be the best it can be. I want to be the advocate for this author's reader. I think it's a real privilege to be an editor. I am grateful every single time I get to work with somebody like Betsy or Case. It's a real joy. I know that it can be difficult to be edited, but you love it.
I love it.
But keeping the author's voice is critical, and I always appreciate if an author pushes back on me. It's like, well, but that's changing a little bit of the tone I want or the structure I want.
And I would say I would never let somebody speak over me.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel strong enough in my voice that if somebody's like, oh, do this, and I'd say, you know, that doesn't make any sense, so.
But if you have great editing, then even when it makes you do a lot more work, you know that it's great editing, and you gladly do that work. I mean, with the Times piece, the final product is much better for the painful editing that I got it. And you know, with other books, Betsy and I both have certainly profited from the good fortune of having great editors. I've also had some lousy editors in my career, particularly as a magazine writer. Editors that I thought of as the equivalent of chainsaw furniture makers. And you just decide you're not going to work with them again.
We probably have time for another question before we hear from Betsy. Any yeah.
So it seems like each of these books were built on your previous books. Have these books now inspired your next idea? Do you share that? Is that something you can share?
Yes, I've signed a contract with Torrey House Press for a third book, and it's going to be ghost stories and the history behind them.
In the West.
In the West, although I might do a West adjacent, you know, sort of like Civil War.
Like Western New Jersey?
No, I mean, you know, there's a lot of Civil War, you know, veterans who
right,
came
the South.
west,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there might be, but I'm a historian, so I'm going to really delve into the history behind ghost stories, because I love ghost stories. And I'm ready to do something other than militia. I am tired. And David's working on a really
And
cool
I've
book.
gone back to work on a book that I was working on when the pandemic began. Mark mentioned that I was in Tasmania, and that was because I was doing the research for a book on cancer as an evolutionary phenomenon. And I came back from Tasmania, and Simon & Schuster said, stop doing that book, just shove it aside, we'll give you a new contract, write us a book about the pandemic. And then when that was all done and the dust has settled, Simon & Schuster said, so, we need to update the contract. When are you going to give us the book about cancer as an evolutionary phenomenon? Your new deadline is da-da-da. So I'm working on that again.
So it kind of relates to both of you. Is it hard? Like, I feel like all of these books are kind of timely and addressing evolving situations. Like, for instance, like we're still having trials on the January 7th stuff. So, I mean, is that, like, the pandemic, like, is it hard for you to be given a deadline on something that, like, where do you stop finally doing research, knowing you just need to finish writing your book, but knowing that more information is still coming on, like, climate change and all these other things? Like, how do you do that under such pressure? Like, I think I do the ghost story book because
Exactly, they're
it's
so much easier.
Like, all these things you're writing about are still very much evolving.
It's hard to write a book in a hurry, but sometimes there are reasons for it, and sometimes it's a bad idea. And I've taken eight years on one book, a couple books I took 5 years, but with the book on the pandemic, Simon & Schuster said in May of 2020, your deadline is December 31st of 2021. And I knew I couldn't travel. Nobody was traveling, and usually traveling is a very important part of my research. One of my operating principles is go there. And I knew I wanted to write a book that, usually I write books about things that other people are not writing books about. But then they wanted a book on the pandemic, and I knew every publisher's going to have a book on the pandemic. So I have to somehow write a book that's going to be unique. And I had those two problems: can't travel, and there's crowded fields. How do you make a book unique? And so I did, Betsy has heard me tell this story before, I did, going into the summer of 2020, I did what any sensible, then 72-year-old author facing a hard deadline for an impossible to write book would do. I scheduled myself for double knee replacement surgery. And then when that was all done, toward the end of the year, I got an idea about how to write a book without travel, a book about the virus, a book about the pandemic without traveling, and a book that nobody else was going to write. And I decided I was going to make the virus my central character, and I was going to Zoom interview, I first thought 60 or 70 of the world's leading virologists who were working on this virus, talk to them about their work, how they understand this virus, what they can tell us about this virus, and where it came from and what it's going to do, but also their lives during the pandemic. These scientists, their lives as teachers, as lab leaders, as parents, as children of elderly parents. So I started on January 1st and spent 6 months Zoom interviewing what ended up being 95 very interesting scientists around the world, each for about an hour and a half, and ranging from Tony Fauci and George Gao, head of the China CDC, to a couple of grad students, female grad students in Edinburgh that nobody's ever heard of, but who were doing really interesting, important work on the subject of how to place this virus in its phylogenetic context, what it's related to, what it isn't. And then after 6 months of that, I started writing, and I wrote hard and finished the book on deadline.
That's amazing. I think it would be hard to know where to cut off.
We were not doing anything else. This is 2020. We were living in this house and with nothing else to do. Again, Betsy has heard this. I got through 2020 on 1 tank of gas.
Whoa, literally.
I think that there is, for a book to really have impact, there has to be some universal element, something that does transcend time in the moment. And sometimes that is the experience of reading it. Sometimes that is an understanding that you have, and sometimes it's like spillover. Wow, it's
A prediction.
It's a prediction, and it has a life that continues. With American Zion, with Betsy's first book, well, the Bundys just kept doing stuff, so we kept that
Thanks,
book
guys.
in conversation. But True West is really about these big ideas of myth that are gonna transcend this moment. So it's, I think from an editor-publisher standpoint, I'm always looking for how do we make sure that we're in conversation beyond this moment, beyond this place, and it's tricky. So, yeah.
How on earth did you initiate a conversation with Bundy?
David likes to tell this story.
No,
I picked up the phone and called him. I just called him and said, hi, I was a graduate student, can I come down and talk to you? And they said, come on down. So I drove on down and spent several hours with them, and they were very nice to me.
Wow, Betsy is very nice. Betsy is friendly. Betsy is open to conversation with all people, and that really comes through.
Less
That's
people
why.
said, virus.
Yeah.
She's not so nice.
Thank you. Certainly, all these people in your book.
Oh, when I
Yeah,
didn't
she's-
tell you.
Right.
No, well, because I had a husband who was saying, prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to get you sick.
I felt the love right at the tip of my nose.
Can I tell the Betsy preparation story?
Oh my God.
Quickly. So I've been in Tasmania, the pandemic is beginning, I've been among various people saying to the world, this could really be it. And I'm about to come home in early March of 2020, but before I get home, Betsy is emailing me or talking to me on the phone saying, well, should I lay in some supplies? Is it gonna get that bad? Should I spend some money? And I said, yeah, go ahead. Go to Costco or whatever and get some stuff, because we could be in shutdown. So I got home and Betsy said, I got some stuff. What'd you get? Well, I got this 20-pound bag of rice, and I got this big box of alcohol wipes, and I got this 5-pound block of tasteless cheddar cheese, and I got $900 worth of dog food. Okay, all right.
Priorities.
And you were ready.
I was ready.
Betsy, I think we're ready to hear from True West. Will you send us out?
Do you mind if I read another?
I would love it if you read it.
Okay, just because I thought maybe it was a little
Sure.
our conversation.
I love it.
Yeah, okay. All right. Ray and Ressa Rothel lived down in a quiet county route outside Glendive, Montana, among family farms watered by the wide and mighty Yellowstone River. I sat down with them over coffee in their kitchen on a sunny summer day. Ray and Ressa had left Bozeman and moved to a tidy little farm in eastern Montana. The Rothels don't own animals anymore. Their horses had been put down a few years ago because the animals were caught in an awful storm that pummeled them with softball-sized hail. It broke their hearts. They have grown ever more worried about politics and polarization, and they don't have a lot of hope. We didn't agree on politics, but we really liked one another. We talked over coffee about how Bozeman has changed, about growing up in the town when its roads weren't yet paved, about the sky-high housing prices of today. I asked them if they were hopeful about anything. They laughed, a sort of uneasy laugh, and said they weren't. This was something saddening I heard a lot in my discussions. Me, on the other hand, I'd grown more hopeful. I'm not sure what happened to us as a region, a nation, a world, but I know that sitting with Ray and Ressa Rothel, in some ways so very different from me, made me happy just to be in their company, and with happiness came hope. Writer Christopher Trey, the irritable but wise Métis, he's part of the Little Shell Chippewa tribe that was just recognized, said it well when he gave the following example. Look at my neighbors across the street. He's got Trump stickers, and I see him carrying his guns in and out of his house, into his car, go to a shooting range. It's easy to judge that guy for that. But then I remember a couple years ago when this other neighbor, who has since moved, got her power shut off. She wasn't going to be able to pay her bill until Monday, and this was like Friday evening. And the Trump guy's wife comes over. She asked Latre if he had any long extension cords. Extension cords? We're going to run power to her house, the woman said. So that's what we did, he continued. I see the dude out with his dogs, and I can tell he loves his dogs, and his dogs love him, right? So I'm thinking we have a lot more in common than not. When would we decide, Chris Latre asks, that Fox News inflamed garbage opinions are going to matter more between us than all of this other stuff? I think we have Looney Tunes, but for the most part, we all have more in common than we don't.
Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Thank you again, back at Beyond Books. Shari, where would you like
At
David
Ed's
and
desk.
Betsy